This is ContactTalkRadio.com, consciousness in action, and you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Conscious Shift with Julianne Turner brings insights from leading voices and visionaries across the globe to guide and inspire you to create your own conscious shift into your true power and singular greatness. Through her expertise, author, speaker, and social innovator, Julianne Turner, a world authority on the creative process, guides you to discover how to consciously create the life, work, and world you most desire. And now here's your Conscious Shift host, Julianne Turner.
Welcome, everyone. This is Julianne Turner. We're so glad that you're joining us for Conscious Shift today. And we are welcoming listeners from all over the globe. And as always, I have a special gift for you. If you haven't picked it up yet, I would love for you to pick up the special report that I prepared in audio for my conversation with Seth Godin on discovering your genius and making your own conscious shift into your greatness and potential to contribute to this world and our conscious shift. You can receive that just by going to ConsciousShiftShow.com or texting the word shift and the number 1, shift 1 to 44222. You can pick it up by text or just at ConsciousShiftShow.com. And again, we have a very special and significant show today. You may be aware that last week the UN released its latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's called the IPCC report, and really highlighted increasing urgency that climate change is, not surprisingly, widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and accelerated by human activity and burning of fossil fuels. And from the Texas ice storms to the California wildfires, we know that climate change is increasingly top of mind for all of us, but it's still a massive and really hard thing to fully grasp, I think, as humans. And so I'm so glad to bring on our Conscious Shift guest today, Daniel Sherrell, who is actually, with his book that he's written, Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World, is helping humanity, I think, come to terms emotionally with this crisis. Daniel, welcome to Conscious Shift.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Daniel, I just want to let our listeners know, first of all, that you are a fairly long time in the realm of climate change, activist and organizer in the climate movement. You've led a lot of legislation and coalitions to affect change in this realm. And you're also helping lead an effort now with green jobs. And you've written this book, Warmth, in a really unique way, in that you wrote it through the lens as a future father, almost as a letter to your child. What was really sparking you to take that approach?
I think when I started writing this book, first of all, I did not intend to write a book. I'd been organizing in the American youth climate movement for the better part of a decade, and had really been in the trenches for years, on email, on conference calls, lobby days, direct actions, sit-ins, basically doing everything I could to build the kinds of power that could pass policies that would actually match the scale and gravity of this crisis. But even as I was in the trenches of that work, the thing that I was actually grappling with, the climate crisis, often felt sort of abstract and far away, and something that I tucked away into a little Pandora's box in the back of my mind that emitted a kind of low vibration of constant anxiety, but it wasn't something I really often took out and actually examined. on an emotional level. And yet, from time to time, there'd be mornings where I would wake up and I'd have to go to my job. And I don't know what it was, but every few months, the enormity of the thing that I was trying to take on with my comrades felt completely overwhelming, and I couldn't get out of bed. And I became really interested in those moments because they felt like the only time I was feeling something at a level that was commensurate with the scale of the problem. It felt like I was actually experiencing reality only in those brief moments of emotional lucidity. And I also kind of felt that if I didn't explore what was happening in those moments, if I didn't unravel the knot of thought and feeling that was kind of winding itself up in my chest, as I sort of compartmentalized the emotional and metaphysical magnitude of this thing that is going to continue shaping our lives for the next century. If I didn't unwind that knot, then something in me was going to break. I wasn't going to be able to continue the work for the rest of my life, which is the plan. So I just started jotting down little notes on my phone as a sort of autotherapeutic process. And pretty soon, thinking hard about my feelings vis-a-vis the climate crisis led me to think about the next generation, my next generation, and sort of realize that low key for a while, I'd been excited about the prospect of being a father and found great beauty in the prospect of starting a family, and also felt deeply ambivalent about that prospect, given what I knew about the scientific projections.
Right.
And so for me, writing to my hypothetical future child was, first of all, I created that imaginary interlocutor to allow myself to speak vulnerably about my fear and grief, because I didn't see many avenues to do that in public life. But I also felt if I was ever going to justify starting a family, the only way I could do that is if I had some physical document, some actual thing that could start a conversation between me and that child about the world that they'd been brought into without their consent. And then if I couldn't have that conversation with them in a way that felt both honest, but didn't sort of blinder them with a rote optimism or deflate into despair, if I couldn't hold them and myself in the space between hope and grief, then I wasn't ready to be a father. And so writing the book was sort of a test for me. Is there a conversation to be had here that I can believe in? And that's sort of, how I started writing to this person that doesn't exist yet and may never exist still.
Daniel, so beautifully expressed. It's touching my heart as your book has, and I just want to let our listeners know too, they're hearing you and hearing how authentic and articulate you are, and also to let them know that in your writing, that comes through so beautifully. And you are also a Fulbright scholar in creative writing. So everyone, the writing in Warmth is also top notch, as is the thinking. And there's a lot of thinking that went into this and a lot of feeling as well, Daniel, as you've described. How do we hold that place between hope and grief and not just go into despair, especially if, like you're literally in the trenches and on the streets and in the rallies and in the halls of Congress, trying to get that legislation passed. As you've been going through this journey yourself, starting in college, and I'm sure in DC and New York and going around the country, what is your sense of the climate anxiety level among, just general youth today against, general humanity today?
Yeah, I think it's different between youth and humanity. I think when I talk to people in my generation, and especially in the generation below me in Gen Z, I'm a sort of young millennial, it is a massive phenomenon, climate anxiety. And the difference between their generation and, for example, my parents' generation, the baby boomers, I think the baby boomers And I love my parents dearly, and they've read this book, they've talked to me about it. We're in relationship around it. And they're very educated people, they're both scientists. I think even them, and by consequence, many boomers, have a hard time internalizing the full magnitude of the climate crisis and what it means. Because their schemas about what the world is and how it works were formed in an era before global warming, as it was called then, was even in the public discourse at all. You know, ExxonMobil knew about it, and they were systematically suppressing the science with millions of dollars worth of propaganda. But for the general public, like, the baby boomer generation has been blindsided by this late in life. And so sometimes I feel frustrated about the silence and the apathy I sometimes see from that generation, and especially political leaders in that generation, with regard to this problem. But I also try to be generous with them a little bit. Like, it makes sense that it's hard to shift tack from a world that was basically going to continue upward at an even pace to a world where there was a big asterisk and a question mark hanging over nearly everything we had assumed about our future as a civilization. For Gen Z, that is the water they've been swimming in since they came into political consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
They've never known anything else. It was like, welcome to the world. We're
Guess
heading
what?
towards oblivion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is an incredibly intense thing to have to hold at that young age. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety and grief. But conversely, very few avenues to take that into community. I think there's a lot of like doom scrolling, as it's called, on Twitter alone in your bedroom. And I don't think that's a very resilient posture with which to ford the upheavals of the 21st century. And so part of what I tried to do with this book is, like, I think we need to do a lot of cultural work to make it publicly acceptable, and not only acceptable, but like incentivized, create the cultural infrastructure to have people like cry in public about climate change and be able to turn to their community in their fear and their grief and their confusion and process it, not alone on Twitter, but with the people they love. And I think my generation lands somewhere in the middle, right? We still I grew up in the 90s. It was like the end of history. You know, Francis Fukuyama had declared that we would all sort of shop at the mall and vote in 4-year elections, and then that state of affairs would continue ad infinitum.
Right.
So it's sort of like, welcome to the world. You can be a doctor, an architect, or whatever you want to be. And then sort of as we entered high school and college, that's when the asterisks started to appear. So it's been an especially strange whiplash for my generation. And I think people are still trying to figure out mechanisms through which to process this thing, which is otherwise abstract and overwhelming and thus easily compartmentalized. So I wrote this book to try, to the extent I thought about an audience at all, and frankly, most of it was autotherapeutic.
Right.
I was trying to think about, how do we open up a conversation for talking honestly about the climate crisis as people and not as policymakers or scientists or bureaucrats, but as people, because this is going to affect almost every aspect of our lives for the coming century and beyond. Which is not to say that the science and the policymaking isn't vitally important, and that's what I spend my day job working on every single day. But I think if we don't have the cultural apparatus and the emotional and philosophical technologies to have these conversations and to be able to look clearly at what's ahead of us, then we're going to be in for a really trying time. But if we can hold each other through this storm, I think that's going to be a big component of our resilience.
Yes, absolutely. And that resilience, in a way, one of the things that you bring forward, Daniel, is that as you come to terms with the grief, that realization, right, actually can help generate some resilience. It seems counterintuitive, but it can help move you from that from that place of grief into hope. It's a very tenuous balance, though, don't you think?
Yeah, it is an incredibly tenuous balance. And I think, but you know, when I look at like the recent IPCC report and how that's landed in the public debate, obviously there's a huge swath of this country politically. They largely live in the Republican Party, but some of them live in the Democratic Party as well, and have had one arm tied behind their back by the fossil fuel interests that are, you know, funding their campaigns. There's one response that's to it's overblown or just sort of shunted to the side, and then there's another response that's basically like, well, we're screwed, you know. Let's all do our Hail Marys and write our last wills, and like there's nothing left to be done here. And I think both of those are cop-outs and born of our desire to have a resolution. We want to know how this ends, right? Are we going to be saved, or are we all going to die? And there's a sort of basic like life or death calculus there that I think obscures what's actually happening, which is that there is a massive spectrum of outcomes still possible ahead of us. You know, and the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and 4 degrees Celsius of warming spells the difference between a world with really bad annual wildfire seasons that we have to adapt to, and a world where civilization in earnest unravels and we cannot feed and hydrate a good portion of the people that live on this planet.
Exactly.
And for every tenth of a degree we move the needle, we are saving or consigning literally millions of lives. So I think I'm both sympathetic to people that feel despair and also think it's a deeply irrational response to the situation we're actually in. The situation we're actually in is one of like immense uncertainty, and we have an ability to shape that uncertainty. And so part of what I try to do with people is both like, first of all, allow yourself off the hook. If you feel grief and overwhelm about the climate crisis, like I do too.
Mm-hmm.
And those are immensely reasonable responses to the dire situation we're in.
Exactly.
But those things should not and need not equal despair. And I think like demonstrating the difference between those two concepts is vitally important.
Exactly. Yes. To feel them, yes. To be able to talk about them and express them, yes, but not to be paralyzed, especially at this moment. What I think that, and see if this resonates with you, Daniel, what I think that your book potentially does is, first of all, I think definitely does is start a conversation that is so needed, and hopefully opens up space for all generations, but especially Gen Z to have to know that there is a conversation to be had, and then to tune into those methods to process, as you said, those cultural methods to process not only the grief but potentially the action and the coalition building. Have groups reached out to you who are already working in this space of bringing together people in conversation about this?
Well, what's been really interesting since I wrote the book is, and it only came out about 2 weeks ago, so it's still sort of making its way out into the world, but I've actually had a few individuals, sort of loose friends and acquaintances, who read the book and then felt inspired to write letters to their own children. Some of them real, some of them hypothetical. And that's been incredibly meaningful. And then, they're definitely, I've definitely been reached out to by various organizations that want to incorporate, that want to help their members who are taking action on the climate crisis show up with their full selves to those meetings and to those actions, not just their political selves, but their emotional selves and their spiritual selves. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I don't want to take all the credit for that, I think this is something that sort of a conclusion that a lot of people in the movement are coming to independently, which is that, if the climate movement is going to be successful, we need to make room for that sort of stuff. You know, I think if you look historically, the civil rights movement did that beautifully. And there was a huge amount, you know, the civil rights movement had a strong basis in churches, for example, predominantly Black churches, which brought sort of de facto an element. I mean, obviously, one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement was a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Right.
And so that was deeply embedded into the DNA of the movement. I think the climate movement was birthed out of a very different sort of set of ideologies. I mean, it came to prominence. The term global warming came to prominence through Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, which was essentially an extended PowerPoint. And then a number of sort of nonprofit organizations like the Sierra Club and League of Conservation Voters and sort of Greenpeace were some of the 350.org were some of the early adopters of climate action as one of their chief platforms. But that's a very different pathway, right? And I think what that pathway misses is the fact that people need to be brought along spiritually. And, you know, even as they fight on, you know, brass tacks politics for incredibly concrete material gains, if you don't have that spiritual sounding board for the people involved in the movement, it's really hard to sustain people in this incredibly difficult work. And I look back to the precedent of the American Communist movement, many of whose political beliefs I'm sympathetic to in terms of the redistribution of wealth and the goal of more equitable society. But, you know, they were an extremely materialist movement, in that they disincentivized people processing their emotions in groups. This is strictly for political business. And I think they suffered as a result in retaining and sustaining a movement. So, yeah, I think I'm starting to do some of this work. Other people are starting to do some of this work. I think it needs to happen much more. And for the movement to be a fully fledged social movement, it needs to exist in the political realm and in you know, really deeply in people's hearts.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the, you mentioned the phrase strange irony. There are a lot of strange ironies, I think, in the climate challenge. And one of them is, you know, the difference in how generations have been introduced, exposed, shocked by this, right? And also, when we have shifts of this scale throughout history, there is it's like the pandemic in a way. There's a parallel in terms of the numbers and the cost is so high that as humans it's almost a challenge for us to even comprehend it. So that there is kind of a disconnection to feeling that this is real, kind of a difference. Totally. And I think that you, in explaining how the different generations have come to realize this, really speaks to that. The baby boomers having much more of that kind of, it's hard for me to fathom this, right? And in the book, you actually you use the term, instead of, you know, climate crisis or, you know, environmental challenge, you use the problem as, you know, your word for all of this. And can you give us a little insight into, I've got some thoughts myself, but I would love to have your insights into why that was a mechanism you chose.
Yeah, I think I chose to never use the phrase climate change once in the book, because I felt like the word had been played out a little bit and pigeonholed into this neat little box of quote unquote environmentalism and policy change. And it sort of struck a lot of people as dry and abstract and overwhelming and thus easily set aside. And I wanted to defamiliarize it for people in order to allow a real encounter with the thing. And as you say, it's really, you know, it's hard to wrap our heads around. And I think that is totally true. it is hard for me to wrap my head around, and I work on it every day. But I think that process of wrapping our heads around it, and more importantly, wrapping our hearts around it, like that is actually a responsibility, a political and ethical responsibility, I think, of living in the 21st century. And it's not an instantaneous thing. It actually takes work to allow yourself to sit with your feelings about the climate crisis, to actually do the imaginative work of like what it means for the future and the future of the things you care about, and to slowly but surely feel your way across its massive surface until you can wrap your arms around it. I think that's probably, for me, I think, going to be a life's work and almost a spiritual practice. But it's one that I think it is deeply humanizing, or I don't even want to use the word humanizing. It's kind of deeply dehumanizing in that it sort of erodes the boundaries between Homo sapiens and the rest of the planet, which we've conveniently shunted into the category of an externality under neoliberal economics, but it turns out we're deeply interdependent with. So, and this gets to a distinction I draw sometimes between knowing and realizing. I think the two concepts are often really conflated, but, and I address this in the book, but most people know about climate change, right? Knowledge is instantaneous. You either have the information or you don't. You either have seen Al Gore's PowerPoint slides or you don't. And one moment you didn't know that if we don't decarbonize by the year 2050, you know, it's going to be 130 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona regularly. And then you see the slide, and then the next day you do know that. But realization, not only taking something as true, but taking something as real and fully internalizing its magnitude, is not instantaneous. It's actually a practice and a process. One of my favorite feminist theorists, this woman, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who was really a genius, she talked about this distinction between knowledge and realization as it pertained to meditation. You know, for example, if you go to a meditation retreat, at the very beginning of the retreat, they give you the knowledge, right? They tell you whatever it is, that the self is an illusion, or that everything is impermanent, et cetera, et cetera. And then you spend a lifetime in a practice that is simply trying to realize truths, the propositional content of which you knew from the very beginning. You know, and I think that was very instructive for me. And I think it's really the same thing with the climate crisis. There needs to be the development of a kind of practice that transforms it from an abstract and overwhelming entity that hovers behind, right outside of our peripheral vision, into a real event that is going to be deeply embedded in almost every aspect of our lives for the rest of our lives. And I think that transition, that conceptual transition and that emotional transition, takes real work on our part. But at least for me, that work has actually made me more hopeful and feel more resilient than when the problem, as I call it, was just an abstract thing hovering behind my shoulder, unexamined and very scary and overwhelming.
And that's very significant, I think. Again, very useful, Daniel, what you're describing. And I love that parallel of meditation. I would never have thought of that. But coming to terms with something that is initially like such a paradigm shift, right?
Yes.
Of your reality. It's a very relevant, I think, wise parallel. Thank you for sharing that. We are going to take just a very short break, and we'll be right back with Daniel Sherrell. We're talking about his book, Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World, and there is a lot more to talk about. Daniel will be right back. Listeners, we'll be right back. This is Julianne Turner on Conscious Shift.
If you love the voices and visionaries shared here on Conscious Shift with Julianne Turner, from spiritual guides like Marianne Williamson, Barbara Marks Hubbard, and Don Miguel Ruiz, to creative sparks like Julia Cameron of The Artist's Way, and inspiring business gurus like Seth Godin and Daniel Pink, then you'll love being able to grasp their wise guidance and apply their step-by-step wisdom to the new Conscious Shift Notes Action Guide series, a version of Cliff Notes for each Conscious Shift show. With Conscious Shift Notes, they not only give you the engaging full audio interviews from each Conscious Shift visionary and the full written transcript, but now they've also taken each Conscious Shift show interview and distilled it down to its essential essence. So you get each Conscious Shift show summarized on just a few colorful visual pages with bullet points, highlights, and key quotes, so you can grasp the key points at one glance. Want to know the best news? Conscious Shift host Julianne Turner wants you to experience the inspiration of their new Conscious Shift Notes absolutely free for a limited time. With her free gift of their first Conscious Shift Notes, Action Guide and Audio Series with Seth Godin, go to ConsciousShiftShow.com to receive your free gift now. In your free gift Conscious Shift Notes set, multiple New York Times bestselling author and creative visionary Seth Godin shares in detail exactly how you can discover and profit from your own unique genius and start doing what really matters to you and to the world. Your first step is to go to ConsciousShiftShow.com right now to receive your free Conscious Shift Notes, Action Guide, and audio, along with their Conscious Shift Show updates from their growing global community of fellow visionaries. Most important, you'll also get to see how you can access all their Conscious Shift Show wisdom in their brand new Conscious Shift Notes collections around transformational topics they've shared, like prosperity, life purpose, creativity at work, transformational leadership, and many more. In fact, their first Conscious Shift Show Notes collection on prosperity is available now and includes Marianne Williamson on Law of Divine Compensation, Julia Cameron on A Prosperous Heart, Dan Pink on To Sell is Human, and Adam Grant on Give and Take, How True Leadership Starts with a Giving Mindset, and much more. Go to ConsciousShiftShow.com right now to claim your Conscious Shift Notes, Action Guide, and audios to guide you step by step to make your own conscious shift into your true greatness today.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Julianne Turner. You are listening to Conscious Shift, and today we have a very special guest, Daniel Sherrell, author of the brand new book, Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World. It is about how we come to terms mentally, emotionally with climate change as the evidence of climate change becomes ever more evident and immediate for each one of us. And Daniel, before the break, we were talking about, how we come to cope, really to get our hands around, our minds around this problem, as you refer to it in the book Warmth, the problem. And I love how you described why you use that term, because when we have a term like climate change, we've heard it so much that we already have a connotation, an immediate kind of reaction, and it's often much easier for us to just write it off and say, I already know that, or I already have framed my thoughts about that, right? Whereas calling it the problem really kind of invites us in to say, okay, what are the edges, the parameters of this problem, and how is it my problem? It kind of brings it both, into our human mind and into a human scale a bit, don't you think?
Yes, totally.
And yet the scale of it, as we were talking about, is so massive. It's really difficult. It's really a challenge for us. And one of the things you talked about that I found really relevant was that we are all going to have these moments of dissonance, where we feel some hypocrisy. You gave a wonderful example of where you were on the way home from, I think, a climate change panel discussion, and you ran out of gas. And there was a moment there where, you were in flux, kind of about how to feel about that. Could you share that with our audience, and let us know where we might find those moments in our lives as well?
Yeah, I think this is one very common way that I found people relate to the climate crisis is through personal guilt. For me, it's like every time I fill up, I drive a Prius, but whatever, every time I fill up my car with gas, there's a sense of real dissonance, as you say. And I think a lot of people feel this way about whatever it is, about recycling, about buying paper towels, et cetera, and I really empathize with those feelings. And I also think in large part, they are bullshit. Because I think the environmental movement in this country kind of got stuck for several decades in an individual consumerist model, which essentially told us that if our path to salvation on the climate crisis ran through the accumulation of individual ethical consumption decisions. So if we just screwed in enough of the right light bulbs and bought enough of the right cars and ate less meat, then that would be our saving grace collectively. But of course, that was never true. And it was a very convenient fiction for the fossil fuel companies that dovetailed very nicely with sort of late capitalism, where we identify mostly as individual consumers, and with the Protestant ethic, where you have to sort of self-flagellate into some sort of moral discipline. And it let the corporations that are actually driving this problem completely off the hook.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about, I want to try to unburden some people of their guilt, which is not to say it's a cop-out, right? I think there is value in taking more public transit and eating less meat, in recycling. I try my best to do all of those things because I think they make a small difference. And I also think it's like a noble act it's a noble pursuit to align your actions with your values. I think it humanizes you in a deep way. But I think we also shouldn't be under any illusions that the only thing that is going to save us at this point is not individual consumption choices, but is building enough political power to contest the political power of the fossil fuel industry, which is enormous, and regulate it into the ground. Because right now, they are the only actors in society that are incentivized to watch the world burn. Because as it burns, they're making money hand over fist. So, and the fossil fuel industry wants you to feel guilty. They've trapped you in the system of impossible choices, right? Where you have to wring your hands over what kind of gas to buy or whatever. Your choices are nested inside theirs, and they've trapped you inside that system of impossible choices, and then trust you to fritter away your emotional energy, basically self-flagellating, thinking you're not good enough vis-a-vis the climate. They want you to feel bad about yourself because that's a very weak position from which to take political action that could actually contest their power.
Mm-hmm.
So what I try to communicate to people is that feelings of hypocrisy are real, but we didn't create the world we're living in. Most people are just trying to have a nice time with their family, go on a vacation occasionally, live lives of quiet decency. And then a few very sociopathic corporate actors, in large part, have created a system that they well knew would put our civilization and millions of lives at grave risk. So rather than spend our emotional energy fretting about the world that we live in and have to act in, let's spend our time building the political power to bring about the world we need. And so shifting people's consciousness, to reference the show, from a narrow window of individual consumption choices and guilt-ridden decisions to a much wider lens, a social lens of building power hand in hand with people who share your values, the kind of power that can reorder how society operates and obviate those impossible consumption choices. That is where we have to focus our energy. And I know that a lot of people under late capitalism see the only thing that they can control as their consumption choices. But in fact, we still do live in a democracy. It's an imperfect democracy, but it is a democracy. And so our task in the next really 3 decades is to make our government turn the wheel on a systems level so that we don't drive off the cliff. And that is the only thing that is going to save us. Recycling will not save us.
Right. Again, really well balanced answer, and absolutely, much needed for us to have that perspective, but also to recognize there's a much larger impact we must make. Those choices must change at the leadership level. What are you finding, Daniel, in your work? Like, you're right at the heartbeat of this. What are the biggest potential needle movers at that level, at the political and policy level?
Yeah, I actually have a very concrete answer to this. The reconciliation bill that is currently on a knife's edge in Congress, not the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which thanks to the Republicans and their Democratic consorts in Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, has been stripped of 90% of its climate provisions. But the second bill, the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, I hate that the Democrats keep calling it the reconciliation bill. It's horrible messaging. People don't really understand what it is. That investment in the public sphere, if passed, would be the most important piece of climate policy passed in this country by an order of magnitude in history. And so making sure that our members of Congress know full well that the support of their constituents depends on them passing this life-saving and really civilization-saving legislation is absolutely key. That decision is going to be made really in the next month or two. So we're kind of in a crunch time. The wind is at our back. If we pass this bill, we'll invest $3.5 trillion in moving us away from fossil fuel energy and towards renewable energy sources and taking care of vulnerable communities and getting good union jobs for workers across that transition. It's not adequate in terms of scope. It needs to represent the floor of our ambitions, not the ceiling, but it's a pretty darn sturdy floor to build on. So we need to make sure that that bill gets passed. Right now, there are a group of moderate Democrats in the House, led by Josh Gottheimer, who is the member from the district adjacent to the one where I grew up in New Jersey. And he, in an extremely short-sighted political calculus, is putting that bill at risk because he wants to say he passed another bill. And I think he's one of those boomers that actually hasn't fully internalized the magnitude of the climate crisis and how desperately we need action at scale, not even today or tomorrow, but 20 years ago, frankly. So there is, in a very concrete term, if you're listening to this and you want to get involved in making sure this bill gets across the finish line, you can Google #SealTheDealClimate, seal the deal. On August 19th, literally tomorrow, there are going to be actions all around the country outside of the offices of members of Congress, telling them that we're counting on them to pass this legislation for jobs, for justice, and for climate, and that they need to stand with their constituents and get it across the finish line. So again, there are actions all around the country. I'll be going to one in Maryland tomorrow, outside Steny Hoyer's office. But whatever state you're in, chances are there's an action near you. So look it up and then get out there, because we really are on the cusp of passing something unprecedented in this country, which is climate legislation that approaches the scale of the problem. But Congress, its passage is by no means assured.
So that is immediate and concrete action that we can all take. And Daniel, just to make sure I'm understanding, the hashtag is just seal the deal or seal the deal climate? The
hashtag is seal the deal. And if you, here, I actually want to get those actions are being hosted by something called the Green New Deal Network.
Okay.
So if you go to greennewdealnetwork.org, the Seal the Deal action map will be right there on the homepage. So that's greennewdealnetwork.org, and that'll show you where all the actions are.
Okay, perfect. That helps a lot, because when I was just doing, just as we were talking, Googling Seal the Deal climate, it was coming up with some good things, but UN level and not US level. So I wanted to make sure it's the best place, listeners, to go is Green New Deal Network, greennewdealnetwork.org.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, so even in the midst of saying that there are few moments where our individual actions can make a big difference, this seems like a moment. And I am so glad to hear, Daniel, that there are a lot of gatherings tomorrow, and I'm hoping that we're going to be hearing more on the news about this from the group Green New Deal Congress leaders and congressional leaders. Do you think they'll be speaking out on this?
Oh, certainly. I mean, folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, and in the Senate, Ed Markey, have already displayed real leadership around this issue and are trying to hold the line against the moderate so that we don't compromise away our future.
Exactly. What you were talking about, Daniel, is, and you speak about in your book, Warmth, coming of age at the end of our world. You talk about the need for imagination and faith, and you touched on the fact that we really need to have a spiritual practice as well to come to terms with this and our role with this and how we come together around this crisis. I remember that Al Gore said, it's a challenge to the moral imagination to understand that we affect the entire planet. The moral imagination, I think that's something that was also cited by the 9/11 Commission, a failure of imagination. And so we really need that imagination right now to be able to envision, as you said, what are the solutions? You said, that there are still a massive, I think you used the phrase, a massive degree of solutions still left. What are the highlights of those? Can you just give us a kind of a summary of those?
Sorry, a summary of the solution?
Of what else going forward that you see are other needle movers, if you will, beyond this bill, in terms
Gotcha.
of every 10th of a degree making a difference. If there were a short list.
Yes. I think if I were to trace a path toward our salvation as a civilization, it would run through the Green New Deal, which I think is a concept, and it's not one piece of legislation, it's multiple pieces of legislation that actually tackle the climate crisis at scale and do it from an intersectional lens that recognizes that not everyone contributes to climate change equally, not everyone is affected by climate change equally, and that we need to take care of the most vulnerable first, and that also fighting climate change can be a crucible for creating a much more just and equitable and prosperous world, where we're bringing people back into the middle class by putting them to work building the economy we need to survive. So long term, I think it is getting a Green New Deal passed in the United States. I think that signal from a global hegemon like the United States goes a long way towards setting a benchmark at the UN climate conferences with the other big emitters like the UN and the Chinese. And so I think really the needle mover in the next decade, this has to be the decade of the Green New Deal. And that will, just like the decade of the original New Deal, which was passed under FDR in a series of different bills, a sort of patchwork of programs that revived the culture and the economy and the spirit of this country after the Great Depression. We are all going to need to mobilize consistently over the next decade and link up with people who share our values and make sure our government does the right thing and gets that ambitious set of programs passed. Now, specifically, how can people do that? I think there are a number of organizations you can get involved in that help move that needle. The Sunrise Movement, with whom I'm involved, have done an incredible job of shifting the debate around climate in this country and making aggressive action much more politically mainstream, especially in the Democratic Party. And there's an organization called Justice Democrats that is working on the electoral realm to elect Democrats who actually understand the magnitude of policies we need to pass to save ourselves. And then there's my organization, the Climate Jobs National Resource Center, that is trying to make sure that as we create these clean energy jobs, those are good union jobs that lift people into the middle class. And I think that's both important on an ethical level, but also makes this much more, will make this a much more feasible political lift if we have the full might of the American labor movement, not just tagging along, but in the driver's seat of this transition. So those are three concrete organizations you can get involved in right now that are doing incredibly important strategic work, but also in general, be an advocate for the Green New Deal. I would argue it is one of, if not the most important policy intervention of our generation. And again, it seems overwhelming. In my experience, hope does not produce action. It is the other way around. Action produces hope. And though it's been daunting at times, taking part in the most exciting and consequential social movement of our historical era has been the honor of a lifetime. And I honestly sometimes feel grateful. I feel lucky to spend my life on this. It feels like I couldn't think of a worthier pursuit. So, hopefully that helps with your
Agreed.
question.
Yes, absolutely. So, just to recap, the reconciliation bill that we talked about first, and going to greennewdealnetwork.org for the Seal the Deal actions tomorrow. Yep. and around that, number one. And then three organizations that you can Google and check out: the Sunrise Movement, the Justice Democrats, and Daniel's own organization, the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. Climate Jobs National Resource Center. Daniel, anything that you would like to share just in wrapping up? I love what you already said in terms of, action produces hope. Any other final thoughts for our audience?
I guess I'd just say that if your relationship to the climate crisis to date has been one of compartmentalization and overwhelm, like, I'm with you. And we can get through this, but the only way we're going to get through this is together.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the author with us today on Conscious Shift is Daniel Sherrell, Daniel Sherrell, Sherrell, if you want to look him up. And his brand new book is called Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World. Daniel, wish you so much more, even more success as the book builds momentum and grows in terms of its readership and impact. And thank you so much for joining us today on Conscious Shift.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
It's been a pleasure. And this is Julianne Turner. Thank you so much for joining us today on Conscious Shift. We know that our listeners are those who are wanting to make a difference, wanting to make a conscious shift. And so these actions that Daniel has shared with us today are actions that we can each one take and make a difference. I will be seeing you on the next Conscious Shift. Again, this is Julianne Turner. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Conscious Shift with your host, Julianne Turner. If you're ready to make your own conscious shift to awaken the power and singular greatness already within you, Julianne is your expert coach and trusted ally, your passionate professional guide to create your highest purpose, profitability, and potential in your life, work, and world. Just go now to Julianne's website, www.creatorsguide.com, and fill in the special pop-up. You'll instantly receive free access to invaluable resources and bonuses that will guide you forward. That's www.creatorsguide.com. Just go there now and fill in the special pop-up. Now is the time to shift into your greatness.